It's not quite the same as our NBC News projections in last night's primaries in Arizona and Michigan, but it's pretty safe to say at this point Vladimir Putin is already your projected winner in Sunday's elections in Russia. Make no mistake, however, he is hardly the choice of all of the people in Russia. Massive protests against Putin have clogged the city streets, and dissidents, here's the difference, now feel free to speak up. As Harry Smith discovered, it's all very reminiscent of what swept through the Middle East last year, so much so some are already calling this the Russian Spring.
Moscow, February 4th. The temperature, 10 degrees below zero. Not exactly perfect conditions for a protest march. We know. We were there.
Россия без Путина! Россия без Путина!
Yet more than 100,000 people walked 2 miles on a bitter Saturday afternoon with one clear purpose, one single message: Putin, go away. And among the leaders, a 35-year-old blogger in a floppy fur hat. His name, Alexei Navalny. This massive crowd was formed first on the internet, linked up through social networks.
Of all the signs and all the different allegiances that are represented out here today, this may be the most important one of all. This is a flag that says Facebook. If there's no Facebook, there's no revolution.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's Digital Leadership Series event with Marshall Van Alstyne. We're excited to show you this video because it represented the birth of our center. We launched our first public event on March 1st, 2012. And it was like a little time capsule that was being unearthed when I found this video in our archives. And so if you think about 2012, how optimistic we were, how utopian a world we lived in, where actually we were using words like social networks and not even social media. And we've gone from sort of talking about democratization, not just of countries, but of companies, of countries and companies, to where we are today, where our view is nowhere close to being as positive as it was back then. So you can begin to see the importance of the issues that Marshall will be talking about today. Before I turn the floor over to Marshall, I just want to quickly thank all of you for attending. I want to thank KPMG and the Beal Family Foundation for supporting us for many years now. That keeps us going, and we thank them for our support and allows them to put us events like this at no cost to the attendees. As always, we will not take questions in chat. That's been disabled. We will take questions through the Q&A feature. So the way it's going to work is Marshall will talk for about 20 or so minutes. I'll quiz him. That's the professor in me. I will chat with Marshall for about 10 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to all of you to ask questions. But as you can tell, this is a really, really important set of issues. So let me just say a few words about Marshall. Marshall is the Questrom Professor of Management of Information Systems at Boston University. He's a good friend of mine, and he's been doing platform research for quite a long time now before people really appreciated how important platforms would become. He's the co-author of the book Platform Revolution, which is a bestseller, and he has been named among the top 50 management thinkers in the world. So he joins an illustrious set of people to talk to our audience here at the Center for Digital Transformation. So without further ado, Marshall, thank you so much for joining us, and take it away.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and I'm hoping to make this interactive and see what we can do to generate some ideas. While I'm chatting a little bit, I want to see if I can share screen in the background and make sure that's visible to everybody. Okay, all right, wonderful. So I say, my, how things have changed from the massive hope and the aspirations in the Arab Spring, or connecting community, or making folks happy, or bringing folks together in community. What's fascinating is that was only 8 years after Facebook had been founded. So Facebook founded in 2004, that was 2012. Within the next 8 years, we have almost a sea change, almost a complete opposite. Now with lynchings and anti-vaccinations and insurrection and teenage depression and even incitement to genocide. It's extraordinary how things have changed. What I'd like to do is to offer a couple of ideas on how I think we can address the problem, but I'd be quite eager in hearing from the audience on any pushback or ways that they think we can address the problem, because I actually think This is one of the most important problems of our time. Pick any problem that you want, care to name, whether it's vaccination or climate warming or who's president. If we can't agree on basic facts, we can't solve or address those problems. So how is it that we, as a society, address some of these misinformation questions? So I would pause for a moment and simply ask you to think what you think the fake news problem is. How would we modify Section 230, which is the law that exonerates platform from the user's content? How would we avoid authoritarian decision making? How would we solve these problems? These are really hard problems, and I think we need some clearer thinking on ways to do this. So I'll see if I can give you a couple ideas today, but by all means push back, and I invite you to offer your ideas to see if we can't construct something that's better. For those who've been watching this space, this was some research on all of the fake news on Twitter, all the misinformation. It was interesting that falsehood diffused significantly faster, farther, deeper, broader than truth in all categories of information. It was really interesting. It was a really nice piece of work done by a colleague, Sinan Ral and Sogi and others at MIT. But what's fun about this is it was scientific evidence of something that we'd heard as kind of folklore, that a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on, attributed to Mark Twain, which is doubly fun because actually that in itself is fake news. It turns out at least half a dozen different people going back to Jonathan Swift have been making similar claims or statements of that form. So you don't know exactly who said it, but it's been folk wisdom for quite some time. But there are dangers associated with that have also gone back a great distance. Even in the French Revolution, it was even long before that. Voltaire had remarked that those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. It's really unbelievable what happens, and we see this today with many of the things that have happened. I would argue that a lot of the existing solutions don't work very well. And so let's take a look briefly at what those solutions are. And almost all of them fall into one of these half dozen categories or so. So one of them is fact checking with crowds or algorithms, or tagging and product labeling so that you know what it, you might give it a little more context to it, or educating the consumers, media literacy, or accuracy nudges, making people think a little bit more before they share, banning the content, truth chasers to give it more context, to try to come up afterwards to correct the information, or demoting it in the newsfeed. I would argue that almost all of these suffer from at least one, if not more, of four fairly deep problems. The first of which is just an arms race. Any technology can be fought with another technology, and so you're always trying to out-invent the other. Another one is discrediting the rater. So whoever's doing the tagging, whoever's doing the labeling, whoever's doing the educating, simply themselves get attacked. So it's just another layer of the misinformation problem. One of the ones that I think is misperceived is that responsibility is on the wrong foot. Almost all these solutions either ask the platform to fix it or the reader, the user, to fix it. Who knows whether they're lying except the author of the content? They're in the best position. So I would argue some of these solutions really need to shift the responsibility to the author of the content as opposed to the recipient of the content. And then lastly, none of them, not a single solution I'm aware of, changes the economics. In the way at the moment, it's almost always easier to cheap lies, to produce lies than truth. So it's easier to produce fake news than truth. On this. So I think that none of these problems, none of these solutions really address the heart of the issue. One of the issues, I think, is how we define this. My view is that most people tend to think of this as the fakeness of the news. I'm going to argue that's not the real issue. Here's a case, a lot of false news just doesn't matter. Is Pluto an asteroid or a planet? It just doesn't matter. Or there's a restaurant that I really like, it was Jay's, whose slogan is "Eat at Jay's and live forever." That's provably false. And the worst thing that happens is you have a great meal if you eat there. Or fake news that you disbelieve, it doesn't matter. So that's not a problem. At the same time, there's also a lot of true news that does matter. Truth that's used to handle voter suppression. Or another one that's used by the anti-vaxxers is a truth plus a truth equals a lie. So you might talk about a famous person that took the vaccine and that they did die 2 weeks later. Both of those are true statements, but you know what? The vaccine had nothing to do with it. So the vaccine wasn't implicated in the death. Or three truths where they deleted one to create a lie. So here's here's a famous person, politician, that took the vaccine, and they did die of COVID a couple of weeks later. But they omit the fact that this person also had blood cancer, and so the vaccine wasn't able to save them. So that incomplete information is another element of it. The last piece of it is, if we're doing mechanism design, if we're trying to write laws, laws are a terrible focus for truth. You can't own truth. You can't be liable for truth. You can't be dispossessed of truth. So if we're trying to do mechanism design, truth is probably not the element to focus on. I wanted to define the problem somewhat differently. So I wanted to focus on what I would call, clearing communications of information that causes decision errors or negative externalities at scale. Here are several examples. So if you lose herd immunity, or you're accusing falsely and conspiracy theories are leading folks to shoot up pizza parlors, or insurrections, so they're believing false information. Decisions are elements for which one can be held liable. The externalities one can be. So I think focusing on the decisions or the externalities make a difference. This also highlights why I think this is so hard. Here's another element. Externalities cause market failures, which suggest the need for intervention. But what's interesting about this is government intervention is expressly barred by the First Amendment. And that's what really makes this hard. If damage is happening because of externality, the harm that's happening off platform, we've got an externality, which is a market failure, and the government cannot address it. So what do we do in this case? Can we design other solutions in a context where the normal methods are just not available to us? And this, again, is why I think it's been so intractable. So here are a couple of solutions, and I've tried to come up with 3 different layers. Some that will be business model compatible, so businesses should adopt them. Some of them that will be not business model compatible, but they're legal. They might need inducements to do it. And others that are just bad law. We're going to need a reformation to some of the laws. So here's some other ways thinking about them. So here's the first possibility, which extends an existing solution. So a lot of folks pose transparency on advertising, for example. I think transparency doesn't go far enough. So one argument is, I want to pair transparency with counter speech access. So we don't want just the information as to who buys misinformation, who pays for it, and what they said. We also want to record the ability to reach those same parties so that you can give them the counter speech. So if Clinton is being lied about, she could actually reach the same people that have heard the lies. You need to enable the counter speech. So, and we can also do it in such a way, you don't need to identify the recipients, you simply allow them to buy more ads. We need to go a layer beyond transparency, and clearly selling more ads is business model compatible. So that one shouldn't be any problem whatsoever. Another one which isn't business model compatible, let me suggest this one. That I would call reverse amplification. We just saw that one of the major problems is amplification of misinformation. What if you do reverse amplifications? This would put friction on liars and not just on their lies. So if you're caught lying, we're going to delay your messages, and we're going to cut your follower count. Cut it in half for a week or 2 weeks. So for example, just as a hypothetical, if you had 88 million followers, well, for the next week, it's going to be 44 million. If you lie again, then it's going to be 22, and then it's going to be 11. What does this do? The first thing is ex post verification is far easier, so it easily scales. But the most important element of it is, if you know you're lying and your idea is to influence others, even ideologues won't disseminate falsehoods because they will curb their own influence. Notice what this does is it puts the onus back onto the author. If you're trying to influence, then you're not going to use methods that curb your influence. So it's a vastly simpler problem, and it puts the incentive back on the author to say something more sensible or to use truth to be persuasive, even in their ideology. Now, we know amplification is a real problem. For the whistleblower testimony, it is abundantly clear that Facebook is putting profits over well-being. We're getting division, we're getting more harm, we're getting more lies, we're getting more threats in there. If you looked at the documents, there were interesting arguments, on November 5th, after the election, folks say, We've been lighting this fire. We shouldn't be surprised that we've now got a conflagration. Or after January 6th, folks were arguing, look, we helped create the Stop the Steal groups. We shouldn't be surprised when these kinds of things happen. Metaphorically, and one of the things that's happened is one person's free speech creates the spark, but it's the amplification, 1,000, 10,000, 88 million times, that turns a spark into this wildfire that burns down the neighborhood while Facebook sells ads. So we need to be able to separate those two things and hold them accountable for their portion of the damage. So how would we do that? These are externalities. In economics, you know of only basically two mechanisms for solving externality problems. So I'm going to see if we can use both of them. The first of them was developed by Pigou, which is basically you hold a business accountable for the damage that they're causing up. So you want to get their marginal costs up to the cost to society, and to do that. That's why there are alcohol taxes. That's why there are cigarette taxes for covering damages and things of that sort. So a Nobel Prize winner, Paul Romer, proposes a variation on that, which is ad taxes on Facebook. What does this do? Shifting the business model from ads could move it to subscriptions, which cuts the incentives to track. It also can favor startups over small firms. If you make that progressive, then it helps with an ad tax policy. So it's, if you're a bigger firm, you pay a higher advertising tax. Then smaller firms can have an advantage, and you solve some of the competition policies. And it completely avoids government judging content whatsoever. Interestingly enough, that's also its greatest weakness, because by avoiding the content issues, a subscription firm that harbored anti-vax, disinformation, conspiracy theories, and false election stories could pay absolutely no tax, where a totally clean, ad-driven business paid a heavy tax. So it doesn't focus on the harm itself. It's too much. Here's a way to get perhaps some of the best of both. So here's a twist on that. It's an introduction. So suppose that what instead we do is that we then apply the tax to the harms, but now what we're going to do is we do it to a flow rate. And we put it only on those things that are already exclusively set aside from the First Amendment. So it's incitement to criminal activity, terrorist recruiting, sex trafficking, foreign election interference. Putin doesn't have a right to speak in American elections, so that should pass strict scrutiny. The other element of this is really twofold. What we do is we separate the original post, which we can protect under First Amendment properties even more than the private companies do now. They take stuff down all the time. But we hold the platforms accountable for the amplification of it. And this solves the scale problem. Once we recognize it as a pollution problem, we can hold them to a flow rate of damage, exactly as if you're holding a factory to a flow rate of effluent. You don't have to sample every message. In the same way, a doctor doesn't sample every drop of your blood to check your cholesterol. They take a sample. By the central limit from statistics, we can give you any level of certainty that you want. You want 90%, you want 95, you want 99.99999. We just take a bigger sample. And it doesn't matter if you get one or two wrong. You simply take a bigger sample to reduce the bounds on your error data sampling. So this solves the 230 problem of holding them accountable. We separate the original post and preserve and protect that, but we hold them for the amplification of illegal things, crime, terrorist activity, sex recruiting, and outright misinformation that's on the platform. There's one possible way to do that. Here's another mechanism. And I want to start with just an insight as to what is a credible claim or not. How do you know when someone's telling the truth? So here are three different bike locks. And these are actually, I was buying a bike lock for my son. He was going off to college. And so here's, how do you know when someone's telling the truth in here? And so there's a claim, we're going to protect your bike from being stolen. So who's got the most credible one? There's a $20 bike lock with no warranty. There's a $35 bike lock with a 90-day guarantee and a 3-year warranty on the locking mechanism. Or there's an $80 bike lock. There's a lifetime warranty on the whole thing, and we'll give you $2,500 if your bike is stolen. We know from this, the last one is the most credible signal. Why? They're so confident they're telling the truth, they're not going to have to honor the warranty because they got a great product. So that claim is warranted, if you will. So one of the proposals is that we develop institutions that allow politicians and super PACs and others, or simple advertisers, to warrant the truth of their claims. A bond is posted that is forfeit if you're telling a lie. And so and it's returned if no one proves it's false. What does this do? No one knows better than the author whether they're lying or not. It's just like the peacock's tail. It's a credible signal in this case. If I know I'm telling the truth, I can warrant that I'm telling the truth because it's not going to be expensive. But if I'm lying, about Burisma or some other activity, I'm not willing to warrant that because it's suddenly going to get expensive. In this case, it's also voluntary. It's an option, so there's no commitment. There's no free speech problem here whatsoever. The honest claimants would be motivated to signal that they have integrity when the others don't. Notice what this does. It becomes cheaper to tell the truth than to advertise a lie. We've changed the economics of one versus another. The other is, notice that it's totally decentralized. There's no government intervention at all as to which messages are true or false. The author is certifying what's true and what's false. The question then almost always comes up about adjudication. So here's one of the next steps of this. So how would you address some of the governance questions in here? So how would you choose? One way to handle this is to borrow a mechanism we've seen in other contexts. So in government, one of the ways we solve the king making the laws and deciding the laws and executing the laws was a bad thing. One of the ways we solved that problem was we split them up. So one of the things we could do would be to separate the rules for defining fake news, that's the legislature, from the adjudication of fake news, that's the judiciary, from the intervention and the decision of what happens, that's the executive, those are the platforms. So we've got three different groups. By this, press groups could possibly even define what fake news. We might even be able to get Fox and CNN at opposite ends of the spectrum to agree on the definition of falsity, even if they disagree on a specific claim whether or not it's false. The next group could then be sampled as peer juries, from Facebook, Twitter, Citizens, what have you. In this case, they have to use the definition provided. They don't get to make their own definition. In the same way, judges have to interpret the laws. They don't get to make the laws. Then we have, based on the decisions, Facebook then acts on that for penalties or no penalties. Notice no one party has incentive to bias it. There's no economic incentive. And because it's split up in it, no one party has centralized control. We help them try to create a decentralized mechanism, not a centralized mechanism, in some sense, for the adjudication of it. So across this spectrum, one of the things that we can think about these different mechanisms is who chooses in this governance. It solves the bias and legitimacy problems, but across all these different mechanisms, disinformation, if we recognize this as a form of pollution, we can bring in several other different types of information economic tools, these externality and network economic tools that we haven't been using. One of the things I argue is why this is such a hard problem is that we've lacked the institutions for dealing with externalities. Courts turn over the problems to the, quote, free market of ideas in order that they would be solved. But we know externalities cause market failures from which government itself is barred from intervening, which is why this is so hard. So part of the things that I'm trying to propose are decentralized mechanisms to do this. So government's not the principal arbiter in this case. So these the problems of these other solutions have been this arms race in technology, discrediting the raters, responsibility in the wrong foot. It's on the readers rather than the writers, and it's cheaper produced fake news than it is honest news. And hopefully these mechanisms help to avoid these things because we can get out of the arms race with certification signaling. The peer juries are very hard to discredit. Responsibilities on the liar, not on the listener. And it's now cheaper to make honest news than fake news. So these are a couple of different solutions. And again, I encourage you to push back. There are many more in the paper. And I also think there are several other arguments about how it is I think laws are taking us in the wrong directions. But this is only 4 of half a dozen different possibilities for things that we might be able to work with. So with that, let me stop and take questions from BJ and the audience. Again, I'd love to get the engagement and the interaction, because this is such a hard problem. I'm hoping that we can make some progress.
Hey, thanks, Marshall. That was really interesting and gave us a lot to think about. Can you hear me? Thumbs up from you, Marshall, because you're the only person I can see. Perfect. Hey, I'm going to start with something a little bit out of left field, just because it's been in the news so much, and then we'll get to sort of your actual presentation. But obviously, we've all seen that Elon Musk is trying to buy Twitter. He raises a lot of free speech issues. And of course, the board has adopted a poison pill, as you know. Curious to think about your thoughts about what sort of free speech issues we have with Twitter, and whether, for example, you think a single individual who wants to take the company private, obviously by law it's allowed, but from the point of view of the impact of a powerful platform like that, whether you think that's a good idea, regardless of Elon Musk.
What is it that Elon Musk is trying to do? So on the one hand, he's trying to create what he calls a trusted and safe environment where people are going to want to be. And at the other hand, he's also trying to protect free speech. On the other hand, that's his claim. Look, I absolutely love Musk for Tesla, for his other projects, and I think those are fantastic. I think in this case, he's all wet and doesn't have a clue as to what he's actually doing. Why would we say this? Okay, I think that's a particularly bad idea. There are several different elements of this. So first of all, one of the things he wants to do is, in some sense, lessen the constraints on folks. And he uses Trump as an interesting example. We already know from the whistleblower documents that he was already given special privileges that the rest of us didn't have. So he was already given special privileges on being able to make threats, on being able to pass misinformation that the rest of us didn't have. And we see where that led. It was an absolute disaster. The other element of it is Musk seems to be completely ignoring history on this. If we look back at what happened with Twitter, it used to call itself the free speech wing of the Free Speech Party. Now, it then learned over time that it had to deal with sexual harassment. It had to deal with pornography. It had to deal with hate speech. Porn is actually enabled by the First Amendment. Hate speech is enabled by the First Amendment. But in order to make a healthy environment where people want to participate, Twitter had to pull back on those things in order to survive. So this seems to be a lesson that he hasn't learned. And we know this is true because somebody's tried it all over again and he's still missing it. Parler left and tried to do it. And what happened? Instantly, people started trolling the authors with free speech and with hate speech and with porn, all of which were completely legal, and Parler had to pull back on all those things over again. So the very things he's arguing for have already been tried, and he's completely missing the fact that it's been done. There was a wonderful argument by a guy who's writing I find quite interesting, is Mike Masnick on Tech Dirt. I said, look, he is fantastic at cars and tunnels and rockets and robots. That's great, and he should stick to that. In terms of humans and speech and the nuances of that, he's not getting it. In fact, in my view, he's reinventing the tire, for which he should stick them back on the Tesla and stay away from Twitter. So I think he's actually all wet on that, and I don't think it's a good idea.
Well, that's a clear opinion.
To put it differently, look at it. At one end, our free speech rights are protecting us from government. At the other end, if the only thing you're going to do it is to turn it over to individuals or private institutions, we have exactly the same problems all over again in a different context. Exactly. We need decentralized solutions, not centralized solutions. And I don't care whether that's government or Musk, both of them have the same problem.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And that's why sort of the last part of my question was, should any one of us be allowed to own a platform like that without any other bodies involved? Because once you take it private, you don't even have sort of the SEC or any other regulatory body paying attention to.
We don't have that. Again, this is precisely why what I've been hoping to design have been decentralized mechanisms for handling these questions, not centralized mechanisms. And look, we can borrow tools from computer science. We can borrow tools from economics and decentralized voting. We want decentralized. If we need to design the market-based institutions to make markets out of these things, not have central solutions, and this will be a far more powerful, far more sustainable set of tools.
So that's trend number. I think that's part of. So I'm going to try and walk you to the audience to sort of where you're going with this. So one of the things you're basically saying is decentralized solutions are better than centralized solutions. I'm going to ask you to define something first. There's a question from the audience, which I'm going to take now, just because I think it's important that everybody understand. We economists get externality right away. So there's a question about, can you just tell us what an externality is and what it means in this context?
Thank you for, sorry if, economists are terrible for terms of trade and then not being clear about these things. So think of an externality as any spillover benefit or harm that happens to a third party on any one or two-way interaction. So to give you the classic example of an externality is pollution. So, if I buy gasoline from a gas station, there's burning the fuel, which then has externalities on the people in my neighborhood or global warming or the things of that sort. So I might buy too much gasoline because I'm not bearing the costs of it. Same thing's true here. I might be taking out ads that are very harmful, and then there are other insurrections or things that are happening off platform, or maybe I'm taking actions that are causing herd immunity to not take place off platform. And so an externality is any harm or benefit that's not taking place among two given parties. It's affecting someone else. And we know if there's a negative externality, you're always going to get too much of it because you're not bearing the cost of the pollution. What's also interesting, if it's a positive externality, you're doing too little of it. So maybe there's a positive benefit. Maybe because people are educated, there's less crime, they pay higher taxes. Maybe we're underfunding education because it has positive externalities. Externalities are really important concepts, and you need to find other mechanisms to get the right level of activity taking place, because we'll either get way too much if it's negative or way too little if it's positive. And so we need other mechanisms to solve this.
So give us a couple of examples of externality in the social media context.
So, here's a really simple example. And everyone will recognize this. Cambridge Analytica. If I played the game, then Cambridge Analytica got all the contact information for all of my social networks. So they would learn your gender and your contact list and your others. So the one or two-way interaction was between me and Cambridge Analytica game, but then it would have affected all of my friends as another kind of externality in here. Here's another simple example. If you do profiling of someone like you, then the fact that you can infer your information means that you can also infer the choices of another person like that, even though they didn't give their data. That's another kind of an externality. So these social networks are rife with externalities, and they're not managed very well. And so we need institutions that will cause them to be managed in a more careful fashion.
So let's go back to the start then. So misinformation, as you pointed out, has been an issue from as far back as we know through recorded history. Is it true that when you said what's new today is, I think from where I sit, and I'm not an expert on misinformation, but two sort of things. One is the amplification that technology provides, and the algorithms that are built into these platforms, and B, it's how many of us now have access to the technology. Twitter is now sort of the global town square, for example, right? So is that the sort of key difference between misinformation 20 years, 50 years ago, 100 years ago?
Well, let's give you a couple other ways to think about this. So it is absolutely true that misinformation has been around a long time. My favorite examples are actually, there are stone frescoes lying about the accomplishments of kings. So as long as there have been kings, there's been misinformation out there. So that's that's pretty straightforward. I do think there are some major differences. One of them is what I would call insulated messaging. So you can lie at scale in a way that other people wouldn't necessarily be able. So if you lie about Hillary Clinton, for example, she wouldn't necessarily know that that lie had been taking place in the same way it would have happened in print or broadcast, radio, TV, because it's all huge public. Now it's insulated and it's hidden. This is why we need these other transparency and access solutions in there. A second element of it is when Randolph Hearst had yellow journalism in the 1920s, another example, you could hold Randolph Hearst accountable. That's not true today, because the party that's amplifying it is different than the party that is the author. And that wasn't true before. So you used to be able to hold printers and publishers and broadcasters and radio hosts accountable for things they would say, but you can't hold a platform necessarily accountable for things that their users would say. So we've divorced the author from the publisher or from the amplifier in this case. But this leads to the amplification moral hazard problem, because the algorithms then are motivated to cause controversy, to cause the harm, to do the other things. Even though they don't start it, they benefit from the controversy, from outgroup outrage, as examples of that. There's one other element that I do think, I've just heard of this from some biologists and computer scientists, it's quite interesting. We may be nearing the breaking point of some of our institutions. They argue that misinformation was never present at this scale. So the massive amount of scale, if you think of it, one, as I observed earlier, it's easier to produce fake news than true news, so the supply is trivial. Also, we know on the demand, the novelty, the outgroup outrage, is in demand. So we've got supply and demand factors that are driving up the volume of misinformation in ways that we've never seen. So some of the biologists have argued, look, coral reefs lasted for millennia and then they pass in an ecological instant because at some point you hit a tipping point of what they can sustain. And some folks have argued, some political scientists have argued, we may be reaching the point where our political institutions can't deal with this level of misinformation. You can handle a little bit, you can handle a certain amount, but once you can't believe anything that's being said, you can't, then you've lost the credibility for all the institutions. And so that may be another level in which things are different today than they were in time of stone frescoes or Randolph Hearst time with yellow journalism. So we have to be careful about those.
So I'm going to ask you one last question, and then we've got a lot of questions from the audience that I will curate for you. So, but the last question is, what is the baseline your recommendations are to be compared against, in the sense of what are Twitter, Facebook doing today? Who's making them do it? And what are they not doing? Sort of just to make sure we're on this, everybody's on the same page as you.
So I would go back to, maybe I should go back to the slide that I had earlier, but this summarizes most of what, see if I can find that back again, I'll put that back up. The summary of the 6 different kinds of things, and then there are nuances to all of these different elements. So I'll just reshare that. And again, it was just this slide here. So it's
Can you put it in a slide, Marshall?
Can you see that okay? It's yeah, so
perfect.
Things are, especially doing things like demoting in the news feed. They're tagging and product labeling. They're doing the truth chasers in there. They're trying to make true things easier to discover. They're saying, this election claim is disputed. For facts information, go look here. Another one they're trying are things like accuracy nudges. They're adding a little bit of friction. Do you really want to reshare this? So that they're making it a little bit harder. Do you want to change cut and paste, again, to add more friction to it? And again, more fact checking with crowds now, but these are the majority of things that the firms that are currently doing. But as I noted, some of them, they don't put the pressure on the author, for example. So for example, I don't know, none of the platforms that I'm aware of are reverse amplifying. One of the things I love, I don't know how many of you in Silicon Valley, of course, may know Stack Overflow. It's a great question and answer exchange, and your privileges are proportional to the value that you create for others, and you can lose privileges. I think that kind of mechanism should be put in place, but it's not business model compatible. Cutting your social network is not something that the social networks want to do. They want engagement on that. So that's not business model compatible in there. Reverse amplification is not business model compatible in there. So holding people accountable in that way, and then cut and branding them as having put up misinformation, delaying their messages. That's reducing engagement, and they're all predicated on selling ads based on engagement. Yep. So they're not motivated to do the right. That's one that's not business model compatible, even though it would certainly be legal to do it. They're just not motivated. So we need to put pressure on them to do those kinds of things that they haven't done.
So switching to, audience, thank you so much for your questions. There's a set of questions around, I think, a similar theme, and I suspect you can see them as well, but a lot of them are asking the question about, do authors actually know, this is from Jeff Margolis and a couple of others as well, do authors know that they're lying? And how do you hold them accountable if they actually put something out there with, that's not called, with good intent, but it actually turns out that they're lying?
Oh, that's a perfectly fair question. And look, we even know that members of the press might actually print things that are false, even though they believe them to be true. So that's always going to be the case. So one of the things I think we really need to do is to parse the problem into smaller bits. So I absolutely would separate harm from intent.
Yeah.
And so this is something I think is another element of how I think we need to think about the problem differently. So if the information is harmful, for example, then look, maybe there are people that believe Clorox in your body is a good way to deal with COVID. It's not. We know that for a fact. So I don't particularly care whether you have good intent or bad intent. That is expressly harmful, bad information, and we need to take it down. What we need to do is to then separate intent from the harm and then hold the size of the penalty based on intent. If they didn't intend something, then the penalty is smaller. If they were intending to cause harm, then the penalty should be bigger. So let's distinguish between the intervention, which is the friction on the misinformation, versus the level of penalty. I'll give you another good example of this, and it's not just social media. One of the most important decisions in the Supreme Court was New York Times v. Sullivan. What they did is they changed the standard on lying about a politician to one of what is called actual malice, which in effect means that you had reason to believe. It doesn't mean actually ill will. What it means is you had reason to believe that your claim was untrue, and you didn't check it. Your subjective belief was that this probably wasn't true, or you had reason to believe that it was untrue. The problem that so getting any kind of adjudication. So in the original context, it made some sense in a civil rights case, but it's now made it almost impossible under any circumstances to hold someone accountable for actively printing misinformation in there. It would be really helpful then if we then separated the intervention, such as a retraction, from the size of the penalty in this. So if we were to lose, so make it very low cost to get a retraction, but still use that same high standard for a penalty. So then we would get more accurate information, but we'd still not chill speech because we're not actually, if you get it wrong, there's not much of a penalty. I honestly think the way to do that again is divorce the intervention from the intent, and then hold the size of the intent as the real element in the size of the penalty. So I think this is a much trickier problem, and I think that's the solution.
You know, it's funny, we were watching the show Mr. Selfridge on Masterpiece Theater, and you talked about retractions, and a lot of the give and take in those days, so this is the early 20th century, was when the British press would publish what would today be called fake news, or sometimes correct news but damaging news about the founder of Selfridges, for example. And it was this big give and take about printing retractions. They would actually negotiate on the retraction to be printed. And so what we're talking about is all this at scale, and then the anonymity of who they're actually targeting with their negative claims, for lack of a better word, is a huge issue in that scenario. I'll take a question from Harvey Shee. It's like, what organizations, entities do you think are making the most impact today with positive change around this problem, and how can we support their efforts?
I got a little bit of a bias in this, but at the moment, I think it's academics. That researchers that are doing. So I do give the platform firms, Facebook, Twitter, credit for really perfecting some of the machine learning algorithms to identify things on the fly. So I give them due credit for that. They've really pushed the envelope on language recognition. But I honestly don't think they've gone far enough in the deeper mechanisms that address the problems. So I think the design of whole new mechanisms has really come more from academia. There's some really wonderful work done by Brendan Nyhan, done by Rand Pennycook. There's some great stuff at Stanford that's going on, stuff that I've been trying to work on. And I also think this is a really interdisciplinary problem. It's not just a computer science problem. It's not just a legal problem. It's not just an economic problem. We need tools that look across these different things. And so I think those are the kinds of institutional mechanisms that we're going to have to support. We're going to have to look at broader solutions to the problem. How can we support them? In some cases, I do think we need whole new institutions for certification, such as these decentralized governance mechanisms that I'm proposing, or some of the warranting certification mechanisms. Look, at the next stage, I'm soliciting funds to go run laboratory experiments to see what works. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to demonstrate that some of these things, maybe we could prove that more honest politicians win. Oh my God, would that be an amazing accomplishment? And I'd like to see that we can try that. So at the moment, I'd like to test some institutional mechanisms, and I would like to sponsor some of those projects to see what else we can do, and to hold some of the platforms accountable for the things that they're doing.
I think some of the things you said, because you're absolutely right? It's not an economics problem alone. It's not a computer science problem alone. So it really takes a lot of expertise to be able to design effective solutions for this. Like, if you don't understand adversarial networks and machine learning, you're not really going to be able to design effective solutions for the problems we're facing today with social media. So I do think it's certainly, as you pointed out, a crucial problem for us to solve. And it's going to take a lot of interdisciplinary work to actually pull that off. So kudos to you, Marshall, for working on that. Errol Arkalik, I hope I got his name right. He seems to know you. Says, can an entertainment argument be the new safe harbor for mis/disinformation? My fabrication was entertaining. And you see, opinion hosts on various TV channels say, hey, we're not news people, we're entertainers.
So again, this is exactly why I want to separate intent from harm. The beauty is, so let me do encourage you to take a look at the paper in there. So I'm gonna post the link again in here in case anyone wants it. But so there's the link in the paper. I think the trick is to focus not on truth or falsity, but on decisions that are associated or attendant to the information. They give you another version of exactly the same sort of thing you're talking about. You can use irony in there. And the beauty of irony is you're using the negative to actually highlight the decision you're making. So what's interesting about that is you're not misinforming with irony. You're actually causing them to really think more carefully about it, even though you're using false information to do it. Matter of fact, one of my favorite examples is actually, I don't know if you know the Alvarez case, but it's an extremely famous Supreme Court case where someone lied about having a Congressional Medal of Honor, and it didn't have any consequence, and so it was ruled an element of free speech, effectively is protected. During the trial, Justice Sotomayor asked this interesting question. Suppose it's a Vietnam War protest, and someone said, I got a Purple Heart for killing babies. I don't know if he's telling the truth and he's a veteran, or if he's someone who's just emphasizing the war. The beauty is that's irony. In either case, if it's a true statement or a false statement, you're still emphasizing what's the question, support for the war or not. You've used falsity linguistically to get the decision right, not wrong. So I don't care if this is entertainment or not. If it's killing somebody, then I need to intervene. That's when I would, if it's truly entertainment, then we hold them accountable at a different level and their intent was entertainment, then you can hold them to a lower penalty. But do you intervene if it's going to cause harm? Then I would argue yes. So I want to separate the intervention from the penalty. And that's another example of the same phenomenon. And decision would allow you to handle irony, to handle parody, to handle entertainment, all of those. But I think that's a cleaner mechanism.
Yeah, so one of the things you talk about in mechanisms, and there's a question from Louis Mark about this, Contreras, like the ease of sharing. And a lot of people have talked about this, right? How can you introduce friction? Is that part of the solution here?
Oh, that I totally agree with. That would be a good example of the existing research on accuracy nudges and adding friction to folks where they think it's, even was it Francis Haugen had suggested something as dirt simple as after 3 reshares, you have to cut and paste it rather than simply click.
Yep.
It's adding friction. That's absolutely a form of friction. So yes, that would clearly be another form, just another version of the same phenomenon of adding friction to misinformation. So again, I think adding friction to misinformation is absolutely one of the solutions, because we know false news travels faster, so make it travel slower.
Yeah, we featured Sanana coming on a year ago now, I guess. Andy King has a question. If a social media company came along and had a paid service for users and warranted the information its providers posted, would that be an example of solution number 5? It's the old saying, this is funny, you pay with peanuts, you get monkeys with free social media platforms.
That is a cool question. I like that question. I think that's exactly right. And what would that do? It would cause them to be more careful about whom they let on board, or they would charge them some other fee, in order to participate. That would work. Yeah, I think that's a fun question. I like that question, and that would be another form of implementation, where the platform would then take responsibility for the content of its users, and you should take a platform more credibly to do that. So yes.
Yes, somebody, Jeff Margolis, drew a link between decentralized information like we see on Wikipedia, where the quality can be highly variable. And here you're talking about decentralized solutions. Like, how do we ensure sort of effective decentralized solutions? Because you're saying there should be no central authority, if I understood you correctly, and it's really sort of these mechanisms that are in place, and no single authority trying to operate these in a sort of a business model incompatible way, for example.
So let's take two different approaches to that. So one is, notice that Wikipedia is not totally decentralized. In some ways, I would call it hierarchically decentralized. So if you have a really super controversial topic, then only certain people are allowed to edit it, because you're getting too many nasty or inappropriate posts in there.
Mm-hmm.
So hierarchical decentralization is actually a pretty good solution. And again, you earn your way into the next tier by having created value at the previous tier. I think that's a very good solution. And you lose that if you destroy value, and then you're dropped back down the hierarchy. So I think that's one possibility for the decentralization. Now, there was another one, and we'll come back to other mechanisms. But I do think that hierarchical decentralization is one good means of doing that. The decentralization, again, is to separate the agency problem of having bias in the system, and that's how decentralization can help us. Oh, there was the other idea. We do have to make careful, so you do get peer juries in there, and as you tend towards science, you will have to have cases when you need Popper's views on falsification of hypotheses. So, if you go to the Scopes monkey trial, the jury votes, you can't teach Darwin. Well, okay, you need to have scientific falsifiability in here at some point as well. So that's the other element of it. So in matters of taste or culture, peer juries are perfect. If it's a matter of, what's the speed of gravity, voting on it is not the right answer. So you'll need, in those contexts, you'll need falsifiable hypotheses that anybody can objectively verify.
So let me ask you the last question of the day. I'm going to reserve sort of the chairman's right, if you will, to ask you the last question. So I love your ideas, and I want to close with, how do you disseminate the ideas that you and the other academic experts, or whomever they might be, the policy experts, how do we sort of help get these into law, into practice, working with government? Because that's going to be, that's where some of the friction also lies.
I totally agree with that. I also am a little concerned that most of us academics don't talk to the legislators, don't talk to the judiciary. I will say that this is an area that I didn't learn this in graduate school, how to go influence legislation. This is something we need to have bigger teams. We need to have folks on board where we can work together to help make these things happen. I'm now trying to talk to legislators, and I think others are as well. I think press attention for this helps. But I think we need to put teams together. It's almost like doing cross-disciplinary research. You get two experts, each in different field, and get them together. Here you get academics partnering with legislatures or partnering with firms, and seeing if you can create teams. This is one where I'd be interested in hearing your ideas on solving some of these same problems. I think we need to get some of these other things in mechanisms in place,
Absolutely.
and see if we can actually get them more attention.
Yeah, and clearly an easy starting point would be more encouraging academics to do more op-eds and things like that, putting sort of essays that we're not rewarded for in the narrow academic system to
We
talk
do
about.
not, yeah, we don't get paid, we don't get tenure, we get no credit for that.
So, but again, Marshall, thank you so much for the work you're doing. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and ideas with us. There's a couple more questions that came in late, so my apologies to the last two questions that came in, but we need to wrap. We pride ourselves on being on time. I want to close by thanking once again the Beadle Family Foundation and KPMG for supporting us. We look forward to welcoming you at our next event that's going to be in June, featuring Arun Sundararajan of New York University. UCI Giving Day is May 18th, 2022, and we would welcome your support. With that, thank you all for attending, and look forward to another session with Arun in June. And Marshall, once again, warm thanks.